As the transport approached Folly Island, Captain Coutts spread a map on the deck. It showed the coast from Savannah to Charleston. Tim's eyes traced their course from Hilton Head past St. Helena, Edisto, and Kiowa to Folly Island, Lighthouse Inlet and Morris Island, which lay at the entrance to Charleston Harbor. We bivouac at the southwest end of Folly tonight, Coutts said, drawing a stubby finger across the map, and tomorrow at dusk we march the length of the island to the shore of Lighthouse Inlet. We will launch our attack in small boats. Morris Island is a sparsely covered place. The captain had things figured 1, 2, 3. He straightened up with his hands on his hips and looked toward Morris Island, as if he were going to take a bite out of it with his even white teeth. It shouldn't be more than 1 day's work to clear the rifle pits and capture the batteries along the shore. By Saturday night we'll be cleaning our rifles inside the fort. Tim studied the map. Morris Island was shaped like a big pork chop, the thin part curving north toward Fort Sumter. At the end of the thin part, on Cummings Point, stood Battery Gregg. Guarding this narrow neck of sand from land assault, Fort Wagner stretched from the ocean on the east to a tidal creek on the west. As he and Red turned away from the map, Tim said under his breath, "That fort is in a strong position. I wish I shared the captain's confidence." Folly was a thin, sandy island stretching northeast like a crooked finger. It was already garrisoned by Union forces. As the transport ran up Folly River, the men could see the tops of Yankee tents above the undergrowth. The troops disembarked at Pawnee Landing. They cut through a little wood on a well-worn path and made their bivouac in a barren place not far from the beach, close to another Yankee camp, 27. They built no fires that night. Tim and Red, Dawson and Coutts sat together breaking out their rations, glad for a chance to rest. Captain Dawson turned to Coutts. "I wonder if the rebels know what's up." "It won't be long before they do." Tim was impatient. "Why can't we march tomorrow morning? We can boil up our rations and clean our rifles," Dawson said. "We can make good use of the extra time." Red laughed. "If the boys clean their rifles a couple more times they'll wear the bores down smooth." Dawson didn't feel like joking. "Sea air is death to firearms," he said. Coutts gave no sign of having heard. "We'll have plenty of support for our initial attack. We have a hidden battery on the shore of Lighthouse Inlet. As soon as the enemy sees our boats our mortars will open fire." 28, Chapter 3, Just before sundown of the following day a corporal from General Strong's brigade came around and handed out squares of white cotton cloth. The men were to sew them to the left sleeves of their blouses to prevent mistakes if they should be attacked while they marched. At midnight came the sounds of quiet commands, the tinkle of buckles and the creak of leather as the men made ready for the march. Tim's men grouped around. Sergeant Fitch and Steele and the others leaned on their rifles. "We don't expect trouble tonight, but we have to go quiet. General Strong's brigade is on our left. We'll travel close to the beach, with the 6th Connecticut just behind." Tim found marching a pleasant relief from the heat and boredom of the day. The moon rose and traced its path across the sky. The breeze from the ocean riffled the marsh grass and cooled the sand. They reached the inlet well before dawn. Tim turned to Sergeant Fitch. "Fall out and be silent," he whispered. The boys sat around on the sand. 29. Captain Coutts moved along the line. 10 minutes to rest and then we embark," he said. "We cross the inlet and wait near shore for a signal from Colonel Rodman's boat. When we finally start for the beach, row fast." In the ghostly light the silhouetted figures fussed with the boats, setting the oarlocks and putting in the oars. The boatloads departed one by one. The boats were made of rough-milled pine primed over with lead and oil. Tim cautioned his men to step with care. "The bottom's eggshell thin," he said. The men rowed silently across the inlet. Tim sat at the tiller in the stern. They waited in the shelter of the grass-covered dunes, dipping their oars so that the boats wouldn't drift. Aside from the occasional plop of a clumsy oar, there was barely a sound. Corporal Steele sat just across from Tim, rowing and watching the rippling grass. "There must be rebels behind those dunes," he whispered. "We'll be sitting ducks if they catch us here." As he spoke the flat of his right oar smacked the water. Tim whispered fiercely, "You're doing your best to give us away." The oarsman rocked and dozed, dipping an occasional oar. Tim started to worry. Suppose they'd been seen by a random picket as they'd crossed the inlet, and suppose the picket had held his fire and reported the presence of Yankee boats? If that had happened, every boat in the inlet would be blown to bits in the first light of dawn. Tim combed the shore for signs of life. But there were none. The lapping of the water against the boats and the distant whisper of the sea were broken just once in that early morning vigil when a lone gull rose with an urgent flapping, circled, and rested again, as the rising sun blazed fire across the sky, flooding the sea with an orange light. The silhouettes of the boats took form and shape. The silence was shattered by the opening shot. An 8-inch shell from the Federal battery arched overhead and dropped into the rebel camp. The Confederates shouted and ran to their guns. The smoke from the discharged gun twisted lazily in the morning air. Tim gripped the side of his boat and watched through the haze for a sign from the colonel. Now the water was churned by shot and shell. A near miss doused Tim's boat, and the boys went pale. "Why the devil must we wait to move?" Tim said out loud. A trickle of water ran down his cheek and into his mouth. He wanted to shout the command himself. The Yankee battery fired again. The shell burst just behind a nearby sand hill. A mass of gulls rose against the sun in a speckled cloud and flew, squawking, toward the open sea. Now one of the boats was hit. The man in the stern rose from his seat, swayed and toppled to the water in a trail of blood. Another was wounded, and his screaming echoed across the water above the sound of rifle fire and the yells of the rebels on the shore. There was a throbbing in Tim's head. He could feel his temper rise. Now at last the signal was given. The oarsmen bent to their work and the boats moved toward shore. Couts's boat was one of the first to scrape the sand. He jumped out, ranging up and down the beach like a fighting cock, urging the men to move in fast. Tim's boat landed just behind Couts's, with other boats following closely. He jumped over the side and into the water and waded ashore in a hail of bullets. Couts said, "Hit the beach and start firing." He knelt near Tim. "Half a minute to get your breath, then move, 31, inland with your men and clear the rifle pits. If you keep moving, the rest of the company will follow right behind." The other boats swarmed into shore and the soldiers started jumping out, holding their rifles high and dry. Sergeant Fitch and the other boys lay close to Tim, their faces streaming and their chests heaving. Tim fingered his pistol. "A couple more seconds, then we go." He raised his hand. 3 yards apart. "Keep me in sight. Move in low and give them a lively target." He moved fast to the crest of the nearest dune. The first line of rifle pits had been deserted. The enemy camp was deserted too. It was strewn with boots, canteens and other odds and ends. A cooking fire smoldered on the sand. Tim and his boys moved past the tents. The rebel garrison must have been small. A cannon on the right was standing alone. Red and a squad of his men moved in to swing it around. Tim ran forward to the second dune and crouched to see what lay beyond. There was a line of rifle pits 100 yards or so away. Men peered anxiously over the sides. Tim signaled to his men. Rising up in full view of the pits, he gave a yell and ran a zigzag course, with Sergeant Fitch and Steele by his side. The other men yelled and followed close on their heels. Neither Yankees nor rebels stopped to fire. The rebels, outnumbered as they were, just jumped the pits and scurried for the rear. One of the rebels was very young. With youthful awkwardness he was trying all at once to put on his shirt, hold his blouse and rifle, and run for his life. As he ran his shirt streamed out behind. He dropped his rifle and when he stopped to pick it up he dropped his blouse. When the boy's face turned toward his pursuers Tim raised his pistol as if to shoot. The boy deliberately picked up his .32 blouse and his rifle and turned his back. He moved a few steps closer to the shelter of a dune. Tim signaled for his men to hold their fire. He lowered his pistol. They watched the lad as he cut loose and sprinted like a rabbit for the safety of the dune, his shirt still clinging to one of his arms and streaming out behind. Tim looked back. The Federal force was moving forward in a solid line. He scrambled up a knob of sand. Beyond him, over a waste of dunes, a rebel battery was just about to be deserted. Behind the cannon the ground was dotted with soldiers in full retreat. The attackers paused to catch their breaths. Off to the right Red had taken prisoners. He was giving orders to 3 of his men who were acting as guards. He gestured and pointed toward the rear, then turned his back on his prisoners. Looking over the ground ahead, Tim and his boys moved forward again, this time so fast that they caught a gun crew off its guard. Tim dropped behind a crescent-shaped drift of sand, and edging forward, found himself staring straight into the muzzle of a cannon, a Parrott rifle not 50 yards beyond. 5 of the gun crew made themselves scarce, but 2 of the braver ones started to empty their powder barrels. One of the men saw Tim and grabbed for a rifle, but Tim brought up his pistol and fired. The rebel winced and grabbed his shoulder, dropping to the sand as the other man scurried away. The fleeing man paused in the cover of a little valley and brought up his rifle. Corporal Steele lay close to Tim, his rifle cradled easily in his hands. He squeezed the trigger and the man pitched forward and lay still on the sand. Then one of Steele's hands left his rifle. He reached into a hollow in the sand and brought out a speckled seagull egg. Steele slipped the egg into his cartridge box and both men stood up and moved toward the gun. 33. Tim spoke to the man he had shot. You hurt bad? Blood had soaked through the man's gray blouse. There were patience and sadness in his face. The war is finished for me now, he said. Tim propped the man against the cannon and took up the chase again. The sun traveled across the hard blue sky as the Yankees moved along the shore, taking gun after gun and turning them on men who had manned them minutes before. About midday Tim paused with his men to drink from his canteen and eat some hardtack and a ration of pork. As the Yankees closed on Wagner there was token resistance, but it was clear that the rebels would make their stand inside the fort. By late afternoon the attackers had traversed the ridge and the last of the coastal guns was theirs. Tim watched Couts as Red and his men swung a big seacoast howitzer around and discharged a shell that burst above the heads of the retreating cannoneers. The advance was halted and Tim settled down for a rest. Captain Couts sat down close by. From where they rested, part of the fort could be seen, a great sculptured mound of earth and sand. Couts pointed to a bastion close to the sea, then motioned to the left. The other salient is just out of sight behind those little trees. We're told the fort holds 300 men. The parapets are bristling with artillery. As if to accent what he had said, a shell from the fort arched high across the sky and exploded short of its mark. The fire from the fort was fitful now. The enemy was saving its fury for the Yankee assault. Couts spoke again. We'll launch our attack at low tide. Just now the tide is high. The strip of sand between the tidal creek and the sea wouldn't hold a company, much less a regiment. 34. Ships of the Federal Navy lay in a flat calm, just out of range of the Confederate shore batteries. The masts of the ships of the coastal blockade could be seen in the distance. Looks as if we'll have naval support, Tim said. We'll need support. As we sit here we're well within range of the guns at Sumter and the batteries across the channel on Sullivan's Island. Couts gestured toward the narrow neck of sand, the pathway to the fort. That beach will be a hell on earth when all the batteries open fire. Sergeant Fitch came by. He smiled dryly and motioned toward the fort. That place is bulging with angry men. He put a hand on his hip. But there's one rebel soldier who comes to my mind who might not find the heart to shoot at all. Blue uniforms covered the sand as far as the eye could see. Tim said, if numbers counted, we could take the place without a fight. That's a pretty big if, Lieutenant, Fitch said. Schoolboys with slingshots could hold that fort. If we go in strong we'll take the place, Tim said. He turned away. He found Red by a little stream on the westerly side of the neck of land. Red was stripped to the waist, dousing his hair and scrubbing his beard with a piece of soap. Tim took him by surprise. That beard would frighten the devil himself. Red straightened up, grinning. A row of wounded lay on the sandy bank of the stream, waiting to be taken to the rear. Tim noticed 3 gray blouses at the end of the line. 2 mounted officers rode along the crest of the hill above the stream. A ferry service must have been set up to bring the horses and wagons across from Folly. 35. Red finished his washing and the 2 men moved up the hill. To their left the tower of Charleston St. Michael's Church was a knife of fire in the light of the setting Sunday. When his boys had cleaned their rifles and settled for the night, Tim found a place close to the ocean, where he could be alone. A waning moon climbed the dark blue sky, and the phosphor-lighted waves that edged the mass of the open sea lapped gently against the shore below. The black outlines of the ships of the Navy, the monitors and gunboats, were etched against the hazy distance. He thought of a springtime more than 2 years ago when he and Kate had sat on Lookout Rock high above the river in the warmth and freshness of the sun, letting their eyes wander over the morning haze, finding patches of pine and green gold willow trees. He remembered the sun striking the river and the trailing smoke from a distant train. When he had seen the train, he had touched Kate's hand. "Do you ever feel you'd like to bust loose and sprout wings and fly to the ends of the earth?" Kate's eyes had shone. "You make me feel that way." 36. Chapter 4. It was dark when Tim opened his eyes, and for a moment he couldn't remember where he was. Then a passing horseman, giving orders, reminded him of their position. Tim was conscious of the silent lines of men stretching away to the rear. And he knew that sentries in the unseen fort waited quietly in the darkness, straining their eyes toward the Yankee pickets, wondering when the attack would come. Fear came to him, then ebbed away. He knew that the hours ahead must be lived a minute at a time. He got to his feet, muffled voices sounded on the left and Sergeant Fitch came out of the gloom. "General Strong and Colonel Rodman are up and about. Did you get some sleep?" "Not much. But most of the boys are dead to the world." "Fitch, do you think the men are fit?" "Fit enough, I guess. But that new lad Green, he worries me. He's so confounded young." The colonel came along the line. "Turn the boys out, 37, we have a job on hand. We must have silence as we move to our picket line." In the ghostly light the voices of the sergeants brought the boys to life. Fitch's voice came in a pleasant rumble. "Here, Steele, time to get up. Up now, Bailey. Come along, Campana. That's it, Green. Time to rise, lad, we have a job to do." And from farther away came other voices. "On your feet, grab your rifles, put on your boots." The colonel's aide ordered quiet, and the sounds died down to a restless hum as the men clasped their belts around their waists, grabbed their cartridge boxes and fixed their bayonets. Tim walked among his boys. Most of the faces were chestnut brown from 2 years in the southern sun, but one face stood out white as chalk. Tim stopped to talk to Private Green. As he faced the boy he thought, "He's just as I probably was 2 years ago, just keep moving," Tim said in a quiet voice. "It's dangerous to falter." They moved forward, keeping their line as straight as they could in the dark. Just as Tim fancied he could pick out the shape of the fort against the sky, a Yankee picket stood in their path, raising his hand in silent greeting. The order came to halt and rest. In the still, gray hours General Strong, with a yellow bandana fluttering at his neck, mounted on a big, stamping horse, moved along the line. He paused near Sergeant Fitch and looked down at the men. "Don't stop to fire. Trust in God and give them the bayonet." Then he spurred his horse, and the man and the massive haunches of his charger and the beast's switching, whipping tail were swallowed by the gloom. Tim noticed that Private Green stood close. 38. "We move with caution till the enemy pickets open fire," Tim said. "Then we go in double quick. The Maine and Pennsylvania boys will come in right behind." The sand gave way with every step, and a lump of impatience grew in Tim's chest. As the soldiers advanced, the ones on the right flank fell back so that they wouldn't be forced to walk in the ocean. A rebel picket sent up an ear-splitting yell, there was a warning rifle shot, and the order came for the Yankees to charge. As Wagner's batteries opened fire, the ground in front of the advancing soldiers was churned by a stream of shot and shell. Tim drew his sword and raced forward, motioning for his men to follow. The ground was covered with dead and dying, great shell holes loomed suddenly in their path, and some of the men pitched headlong into the yawning cavities. The figures of the charging men were punched in black against the brilliance of enemy fire. As Tim moved into the choking, blinding haze, a shell hit close. The familiar bulk of Sergeant Fitch spun around, suspended for a moment, then crumpled in a gesture of death. Fear cut into Tim like a knife of ice. His knees were numb, but he moved in a crescendo of speed for the outer work. A soundless screaming tearing at his throat, a dozen or so men had halted just behind the man-made ridge of sand. "Don't stop to fire!" Tim yelled. In the light of the exploding shells he caught sight of Captain Dawson just to the left. Dawson was rocking a man in his arms, rocking and sobbing in a ghastly burlesque. Tim scrambled over to Dawson's side. The light of a following shell showed him that the man Dawson was holding was dead. Tim wrenched the dead man free, 39, grasped the front of Dawson's blouse and hit him full force in the face with the flat of his hand. "Move on," he shouted. Dawson shook his head in confusion and got to his feet. With the shriek of shells splitting his ears, Tim grasped his sword and dashed across the trembling sand toward the water of the moat where it reflected the flashes of cannon fire. A wounded soldier lay at the water's edge, struggling to rise. Tim grabbed the man's blouse and dragged him clear so that he wouldn't drown. As Tim straightened up he saw a half-familiar figure dashing toward him. "It's Private Green," he said aloud. Together he and Green dashed into the moat. Tim heard a splash. Green lay in the water, face down. Tim reached for the boy to pull him out, but Green jumped up. "I'm alive. I only tripped," he screamed. "Alive, alive." Tim choked down a desperate laugh as he rushed for the massive, sloping bank of earth. Scrambling up the rutted parapet, he felt something sharp prick the seat of his pants. He swung around and looked into the dogged face of Private Green. "Private Green," he said, "watch what you do with that bayonet." Daybreak was streaking the sky in the east. In the gathering light a scattering of Yankees had dug in just below the crest of the parapet, firing rapidly into the fort. The ground below the fort was peppered with rifle and cannon fire. It was clear to Tim that the Federal ranks were threadbare. The supporting regiments had dropped to the ground behind the outer work. A shell hit a portion of 40, the work, spraying sand into the air, picking up men like jackstraws in a gale and sending them sprawling back to earth. Tim whipped the air with his sword and shouted through the smoke and noise, rallying his men. He slipped and scrambled to the crest where the sandbags were stacked. He kept moving as he reached the crest, half sliding, half jumping into the fort. He was blinded for a moment by a thick cloud of acrid smoke that made him cough and choke. As the smoke blew away he saw a rebel sergeant straight in front of him and cannoneers at either side. He lowered his sword. Off to the right a big voice commanded the sergeant. "Hold your fire." A Confederate lieutenant moved toward Tim, his pistol ready, a broken-toothed smile cracking his leathery face. "A prisoner, sir." 41, Chapter 5, Tim sheathed his sword. "Your sword and pistol," the lieutenant said. Tim unbuckled his belt, slid off his bolstered pistol and held it toward the man. "I'll surrender my sword to the officer who commands this battery," he said. The lieutenant nodded. "As you wish it, sir," he said, raising his voice above the rattle of musket fire and pointing to a man who was stripped to the waist and covered with grime and sweat. "There's Captain Chichester. Surrender your sword to him." The Confederate captain turned as Tim walked toward him. The captain nodded respectfully. He reached for his pistol and handed it to a boy not more than 12 years old who stood by his side. "Guard this prisoner," he said, "and mind you don't shoot him by mistake." Tim walked with the boy to a place near a bomb-proof shelter where empty powder barrels were thrown helter-skelter on the sand. "I'll sit on one of these," he said to the boy. "I'm tired." The boy stood nearby, serious and manly, but frightened. 42, too. He pointed the revolver at the ground and looked at it to be sure he knew how it worked. With his chin down he looked back at Tim. Tim sat on the barrel, looking off through the smoke, the racket of battle in his ears, the screaming of soldiers, the thunder of cannon and the chatter of rifle fire. His spirit was chilled. Fitch was dead. He wondered whether Red and Coutts were lying lifeless in the moat, or were they prisoners too? He thought of the rebel soldier he had wounded. Was it yesterday? The man had said, "The war is finished for me now." And now, Tim thought, the war is finished for me too. A huge siege gun was fired close by, shaking the earth and sending a puff of acrid smoke rolling along the sandbags at the top of the parapet, making the gunners cough and choke. All at once the firing stopped, the last musket cracked. The smoke of the battle rose above the fort and thinned as it was blown away. The sun filtered through the gloom and there were voices in the silence. Loud at first, then soft, like the voices of schoolboys when the teacher comes into the room. Captain Chichester, his shirt draped loosely around his shoulders, walked toward Tim through the thinning smoke. Tim stood up, reached for his sword and handed it to the captain. The man's sand-colored hair and eyebrows were dusted with powder that ran in streaks down his tanned face. His blue eyes reflected a sleepless night and a morning of battle. "No cause for Yankee shame today," he said. The powder monkey stood by his captain now, handing him his pistol. Looking up at his face, Tim looked toward the big guns. "Captain," he said, 43, "I wonder if I could see the field beyond the parapet?" The captain lowered his eyes. "It's a heartbreaking sight," he said, and he raised his eyes and held Tim's gaze, as if he wished he could say more. The two men walked toward the parapet, the boy tagging along behind. The rebel soldiers gawked, and one big sergeant spat hard on the blackened sand. "Save your spit for the next assault," the captain said with a look of towering disgust. As they reached the gun he turned to Tim. "There's an armistice in effect," he said, "to give your men a chance to carry off the wounded and bury the dead. The boy and I will stay back here. I've seen enough today." Tim moved up beside a gun and looked across the plain. The dusky, shadowy world of early morning had given way to a sunlit day. There were no shell bursts or knife-like tongues of flame, just silence and the litter of death. Scattered in terrible profusion on the sand, under a flag of truce ambulances moved along the beach, hurrying to gather up the wounded before they were claimed by the incoming tide. A surgeon who was working at the edge of the moat signaled to a driver. "Here's one alive," he called. An ambulance creaked and rattled to where the man lay. The surgeon and the driver lifted the wounded man gently into the canvas-covered vehicle. With sickening dread Tim's eyes moved across the distance, studying the men who lay on the sand. He fancied he saw a red-haired officer lying in the distance with his feet to the sun, but he couldn't be sure. Men lay at the base of the parapet, almost covered by the waters of the moat which was fed by the ocean tides. Tim suddenly wondered what had happened to Private Green, 44, he looked once more across the plain at the dead and broken and dying. Then he turned to the captain and the boy who stood by his side. "There are other prisoners waiting by the Sally Port," Chichester said. He looked down at the boy. "Billy Moore will show you the way." "Thank you for your courtesy, sir. What is your name?" "Lieutenant Bradford, 7th Connecticut Volunteers." "Maybe we'll meet again on a happier day," the captain said. He turned and walked away with two swords swinging and rattling at his side. As Tim followed the boy past the bomb-proof, the boy spoke. "All Yankees aren't bad," he grinned, "but most are devils, sure enough." "You come from Charleston, lad?" "I come from Beaufort, sir," he said with a sudden frown. "It was the Yankees chased us away." They left the shadow of the bomb-proof and walked through the Sally Port, and there, guarded by half a dozen men, were 40 or 50 Yankee captives. There was Dawson, hatless, with his corn-colored hair shining in the sun, his face like death. An ugly welt ran across his cheek. One guard laughed when he saw the unarmed boy with the tall Yankee. "Big fish this time, little Billy," he rasped. "Give him over to me." Tim nodded to the boy and went to Dawson. "Glad to see you still alive," he said. Dawson looked sullenly at Tim. "I'm tired," he said with bitterness. "I'm glad to be out of it, if you want to know the truth." "Any word of Kelly or Captain Coutts?" "None that I know of." 45, a big rebel sergeant moved close to them with studied ease and snapped, "That's enough talking. You'll have plenty of time to talk in jail. Tim thought, if Red is dead I'll visit his wife and child when I get home. But I pray to God he lives. Off to the east thunderheads were piling up, and a stiff breeze sprang up. A rusty steamer came puffing and wallowing across the choppy waters and made fast to the pier just to the west of the Confederate battery at Cummings Point. As the prisoners clattered along the pier, Tim wondered if the flimsy structure would hold them all. It creaked and groaned as one by one the men jumped to the heaving deck. As Tim stood by the rail he caught sight of a familiar face. "Private Green," he said. Green turned a happy face and worked his way behind the crowd of men along the rail. Tim clasped the boy's hand. "Glad to see you, lad." Green just smiled. "Have you seen Lieutenant Kelly or Captain Coutts?" "No, Lieutenant." As the steamer moved away from the shelter of land it was lifted by swells that swept in from the open sea. The little ship rolled and tossed and smacked the waves, sending up sheets of spray and wetting the men who were wedged along the rails. It seemed to Tim she was carrying too many men. "If we make it to Charleston I'll be surprised." Green smiled shyly. "Let's mutiny," he said, and sailed to Boston on the afternoon tide. Suddenly there was a commotion near them at the rail and one of the prisoners jumped over the side. Tim saw, 46, the flash of a shirt, then he saw a boy swimming and drifting swiftly astern. He said, "What chance does he think he has?" A guard dashed out of the wheelhouse onto the shuddering deck. He raised his rifle and fired. Green gritted his teeth and clenched his fists in a helpless fury as he watched the head of the struggling boy. For the love of mercy, why don't they give him a chance? 2 shots followed the first, but the boy's head still bobbed above the water. The 4th shot hit its mark. One of the swimmer's hands thrashed weakly for a moment and he dipped below the surface, leaving a slick of blood to mark the place where he had disappeared. Green's face was pale. He quivered with rage and fear. He stared transfixed and then, with a convulsive shudder, leaned over the rail and was sick. Tim put his hand on the boy's shoulder and looked across the water at the stretch of beach that led to the mouth of the creek and the freedom of the Yankee lines. The steamer made straight for Sumter. The fort stood like a block of granite in the harbor's mouth, the sea dashing against the outer walls. Now the sky was solid lead, washed across with moving clouds. The steamer nudged Fort Sumter's wharf. The sailors looped the hawsers around the pilings, the sergeant of the guard leaped to the dock and was admitted to the fort. The steamer creaked and groaned against the pilings and Tim leaned on the rail with Green beside him, looking up at the silent gray walls. The sergeant walked back along the pier with his head down and his arms swinging at his sides. As the steamer moved toward Charleston, leaving the silent gun ports in its wake, Tim noticed a flag at the top of the pole inside the fort. It snapped in the stiffening, 47, breeze, its colors sharp against the flat, gray sky. "I wonder," he thought, "how long that flag will fly." The harbor was dotted with the sails of fishing boats seeking shelter from the coming storm. The city of Charleston was strung across the horizon, her rose brick and white-walled buildings like spots of color in a child's painting, her church towers standing high above the piers and parks and the houses that lined the waterfront. Off to the right, masts and spars and a complex of shrouds marked the wharves on the eastern shore of the peninsula. Green's voice barely rose above the thump of the paddle wheels. "Where are they taking us, do you suppose?" "There's a jail in Charleston," Tim said, "and others scattered throughout the South." "Are the stories of rebel prisons true?" "I've never been in a rebel jail," Tim said. "There's always hope of being exchanged. The Confederacy can't afford to have her soldiers wasting away in northern prisons." Tim watched Green's face. "Promise me something, will you, Green?" "What would that be?" "Lieutenant. Promise me if you try to escape you'll pick a time when you have a fair chance." Green spoke earnestly. "I wasn't thinking of escape just yet. I'll have to see the prison first. I'll have to think on it a while." Tim laughed. "I'll waste no more of my worry on you." The little steamer swung slowly around as it maneuvered to move toward one of Charleston's piers. Now in the moment before the storm Tim saw a little island at the mouth of the river. Part of the island was struck by sunlight. On the sandy shore 3 men struggled to beach a boat, their figures distinct in the slice of light. 48. There was a sudden gust of wind and the rain sluiced down, blotting out the little scene. It streaked down the faces of the prisoners and ran down their collars. At first it seemed a blessed thing, but as it drenched the men on the deck Tim stared across the flat, grey water whipped by rain, and a cold apprehension took root in his heart. As the little steamer docked the rain stopped and the clouds blew away. The prisoners marched with their guards along the wharf, across a glistening cobbled street to a shed-like building that faced the waterfront. A short, sunny-faced woman came out and spoke to the sergeant of the guard. "We didn't have much warning," she said. "You'll have to give us a minute or two." The sergeant frowned and mumbled something. Then the woman raised her chin and looked down the line of men, wet and disconsolate in their dirty uniforms. "Well, you'll have to wait," she said. Without pausing for an answer she went inside. Tim stood on the cobbles and studied the row of fine brick houses that faced the river. This was the first time in months that he had stood on a street and looked at houses where people dined and slept, where children were born and raised. The sunny-faced woman came out again, followed by others carrying trays of coffee and slices of buttered bread on squares of white paper. As the women moved among the men Green straightened up and lowered his chin and brushed his cheek with the back of his hand. "They're just like the ladies of Philadelphia," Tim said, "who served us goodies 2 years ago." One of the women, dark-haired and young, turned to him. "Need is need, wherever it may be," she said with a sweet, sad smile. Tim noticed how graceful she was in her starched white, 49, dress and pale blue shawl. She was so much like Kate that he felt his knees go weak. As she turned away he was filled with a yearning for home, a longing to sit on his horse and ride along the river road underneath the sunlit leaves until Kate's house came into view. When the women had disappeared into the building again the rebel sergeant slapped the stock of his rifle. "Quiet," he said. "Now we march to the railroad depot." They marched through the streets and alleys lined by houses, sometimes neat and tidy, sometimes deserted and forlorn. There were gardens filled with summer flowers still in bloom, palmetto trees along the sidewalk, dark green painted doors with knobs and knockers of polished brass. People leaned on their windowsills to watch the passing prisoners. Some of them hissed or spat. Others watched with expressions of compassion or concern. A scattering of ragged children ran ahead of the prisoners, spreading the word that they were on the way. They rounded a corner and walked along a wide cobbled street where most of the houses were of the single style, narrow at the front, with piazzas facing lawns and gardens at the sides. People were gathering on the sidewalks, and as the prisoners approached St. Michael's Church the crowd grew thick. Surged from under the portico and broke into catcalls and jeers. The soldiers of the rebel guard flashed their bayonets and drove the people back. Most of the prisoners walked straight and proud. Tim set his jaw and stiffened his back but he couldn't stop the trembling in his knees. A gang of little boys dodged around the pillars of the church and one of them skittered through the crowd, made a face and flapped his hands like donkey ears. He reached into his pocket and brought out a tomato. Tim saw the 50 boy's arm arch back as he took deliberate aim. The love apple caught the rebel sergeant just over his ear. The sergeant moved to catch the boy. "I was aiming at a Yank," the little fellow screamed as he dashed behind the skirts and capes that lined the street. People in the crowd began to laugh, the women first, and then the men. The sergeant's face turned red, and even Yankee snickers turned to laughs. Then there was silence. The laughter of the Yanks had made the joke go sour. As they moved along the middle of the street, carriages and wagons pulled aside to let them pass. The drivers turned hostile faces on the men in blue. Tim brushed past the bright red wheels of a gleaming carriage and for a moment he looked into the face of a woman in the back seat. She was about his mother's age and dressed in black. Her face was beautiful and filled with sadness. Now the urchins who followed the prisoners were joined by others led by a dark-haired older boy. They screamed and taunted. They threw pebbles as they surged along the sidewalks and into the street ahead of the prisoners' line of march. The sergeant of the guard was flushed with anger. When the leader of the gang began to taunt the prisoners the sergeant grasped the boy's collar, tearing the shirt right off his back. Next time I'll give you the bayonet, the sergeant said. The boy grabbed his shredded shirt from the dirty stones and ran ahead with his gang behind him to the shelter of a narrow street. The sergeant and the other guards watched as they passed the street. All at once the boys appeared again and pelted the column with stones. A mean-faced rebel corporal was hit in the leg, and he, 51, and the sergeant, with another guard, dashed after the boys as they scattered like quicksilver into the alleys and doorways of the dingy street. Green's face showed his excitement as the column was left with just one guard. Tim grabbed Green's arm. This is no time to think of escape. Charleston is a cul-de-sac. They could seal off this peninsula easier than closing a cracker box. Green relaxed. Never even crossed my mind, he said with a smile.